Welcome, welcome, everyone. It's really great to see you all and have you join us today. My name is Allison Cornish, and I am the Chaplaincy Initiative Coordinator for the BTS Center in Portland, Maine, although I live in Western Massachusetts on the land of the Nipmuc. I am so glad that you are able to join us today, and I am so glad to be gathered with our wonderful presenters today. I'm going to pass this over to Nicole from the BTS Center, our program director.
Thank you, Allison, and hello, friends. I bring you greetings on behalf of the BTS Center's staff team and Board of Trustees. The BTS Center is the organizational successor to Bangor Theological Seminary, and we are focused on spiritual leadership for a climate-changed world. We engage with pastors, spiritual directors, preachers, lay leaders, and chaplains. And we host continuing education and vocational formation programs in the form of book studies, retreats, and public conversations like this one. We're so grateful for all of our partner organizations in this work, including, and perhaps especially today, the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab. Michael.
Thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you to the BTS Center for welcoming me, for welcoming the lab. The BTS Center was actually the very first organization to extend a grant to the lab way back in 2018. So they are our longest standing supporter. And I'm very grateful that Nicole gave the historical explanation, because as a Midwesterner, I have never known how to pronounce Bangor. So I'm very glad to know that is how it is pronounced. So thank you very much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to this conversation on a topic that we get lots of inquiries about all the time. And so to connect moral injury to climate change is something that I think is really necessary. And I'm very glad that we're all here doing it together.
Thanks, Michael. I want to say just a few more words about the BTS Center's work on chaplaincy and the environment, or chaplaincy and earth and climate. The BTS Center is particularly interested in chaplains who already have and employ the skills that are so needed in our climate change world. You already are assisting individuals and communities in accepting and making really difficult choices and adapting to change. You already understand trauma and help people move through it. You offer rituals and practices around loss and grief and healing. You help people with meaning making. You help tend to loss and grief and brokenness. And you help cultivate and maintain hope and resilience, and so much more. Who you are as chaplains is so needed in our climate changed world. And so we're particularly glad that you as a group are joining us today. So I'm going to invite you to open up your chat if you haven't already. And I'm just going to offer a few prompts here for us to warm up and get to know who's in the room. So for the first prompt, please say hello in any language you choose. Say hello in any language you choose in the chat. I see hola and hello and halo and meow and a few more holas and bonjour and hi there and greetings and more and more and more. Shalom to you as well. Keep those hellos coming. And then add to the chat, where are you zooming in from today? Where are you zooming in from today? What's our reach? Salem, Oregon, London, the UK, Chicago, Hampton, Virginia, Connecticut, Northampton, Auckland, New Zealand, Brooklyn, oh my gosh, and so many more places. Keep them coming. And then finally, what might you say about your local ecosystem? Is there something strong or something fragile in your immediate neighborhood? In your immediate neighborhood, I already saw drought and damp and rain and river power and fragments and no winter and flooding and vulnerable forests. and spring emergence and the Susquehanna River and the sun and the rising temperatures and the microclimates. Oh my goodness, you are creating a poem here. Thank you so much, and keep it coming as I pass it over to Michael.
Thank you very much, Allison. I'm very pleased to introduce our first panelist today, who is also a longstanding colleague of the lab. So it is my honor to introduce Rita Nakashima Brock, who has been Senior Vice President for Moral Injury Programs at Volunteers of America since 2017. She's an award-winning author and has been a professor of religion, women's study, and Asian American studies for 18 years, including the endowed chair in humanities at Hamline University, director of the Radcliffe Institute Fellowship Program at Harvard, a fellow at Harvard Divinity Center for Values in Public Life, and a visiting scholar at Starr King School for the Ministry. From 2012 to 2017, she co-founded and directed the Soul Repair Center at Bright Divinity School, and she is the co-author of one of the first books ever written on moral injury, titled Soul Repair: Recovering from Moral Injury After War, as well as many other books. And I assure you that was a much abbreviated version of Dr. Brock's biography, and so we're very pleased to have her with us. Rita, we'll turn to you.
Thank you, Michael. It comes with being old. There are a lot of things on your Vita sometimes. It's a lot of my peers at my age have a Vita that's pretty complicated as well. But it's wonderful to be with you all. I come to you from Maplewood, Minnesota, which is Lakota territory. Is where I also taught at Hamline University for 7 years in the 90s. Before I left, and so I'm really pleased to be here. I've resettled here in Minnesota while working, but I've also planned to retire here for partly climate change reasons. So these are things I would never have 20 years ago thought I needed to consider in where I plan to age and die. So I'm going to start my talk now by sharing my screen, which is always a little more complicated than I think it's going to be. Okay, can everyone see it? All right. Okay, this is just the title screen. This is for the people who aren't here that are going to get the PDF. Basically, moral injury is related to the fact that we all have a moral orienting system. The clinicians, the scientists who've been studying moral injury have been saying things that I'm a theologian. It's something that I would be saying, but I didn't expect it out of the mouths of psychiatrists who are saying now that they think that moral injury is an indication that we're all born moral, that it isn't something we just acquire from relationships where our brains are hardwired to be moral, which is why moral injury is such a devastating thing to suffer. So anybody who's been to seminary or studied theology all knows that a moral orienting system is what is just implicitly what guides your sense of where you relate to the cosmos, to the world, and the relationships in your life, including a relationship to our environment. And it operates most of the time without thinking. We gain it from childhood as partly with language as a kind of osmosis that shapes us deeply. But as long as relationships go along and things are smooth, we don't really think about right and wrong things because we just automatically know how to behave. So what happens to our moral orienting system is that it can be challenged and changed. And one way it's challenged and changed is through training, which is something like boot camp is a very effective short process of changing people. Whoops, sorry. So it can be done that way. It can be changed by circumstance. You may move to a different country and suddenly find yourself where your automatic patterns of behavior and relating to people are a little bit dysfunctional, and you have to learn a whole new way of being in the world. And that can actually change some of your moral orienting system because you realize, oh, I was doing this and I actually prefer this other thing or whatever. And then moral injury is the way your moral orienting system is challenged by a very intense and devastating experience. And intense and devastating may be cumulative or it may be sudden. It's not one thing, but an experience that completely makes you wonder who you are, and all of that is when your moral orienting system doesn't work for you anymore. So Nancy Weiner at Hebrew College in New York developed this gradation of severity to understand how we're all moral and how we have moral conflicts. It's not like we go through life and we do everything perfectly right all the time. So moral discomfort comes from somebody doing something to us, or us doing something to someone else, or whatever. I apologize to my cats even occasionally because I do something that hurts them. So this moral discomfort, the way we sort that out is we try to figure out what to do, what's the right thing, and that's how we maintain our daily relationships. So moral discomfort is just an ordinary universal human experience. Moral distress is when we may do morally discomforting things or experience morally troubling things, and it becomes unclear how to fix the problem. Or you may be in life circumstances where you cannot do the right thing, that you're just unable to do it. I think an example of that we experienced during the pandemic is all the hospital staff who were normally able to comfort patients who were dying and support them, but who were so overstressed by the numbers of sick people that they couldn't do that. And they felt that as a kind of moral distress, that people had to die alone, untended, or in ambulances because they couldn't even get in the door of an emergency room. That's a serious thing, moral distress, because it can begin to interfere with your daily functioning, especially if you can't figure out how to fix a problem, or a system or an event makes it impossible to fix a problem. And if it accumulates enough, or if the event is catastrophic, a single event is catastrophic enough, we may, what I call break, we may begin to wonder who we are as moral human beings. We may that's an identity crisis. We may pull away from relationships because we don't think we're worthy of being loved anymore, or we may just give up and slip into a state of despair or even cynicism. So the way moral injury comes is that we can experience harm by the failures and immorality of others, or be involved in systems of power that are harmful, or we can actually ourselves transgress. We can violate our own moral codes. And I think there are examples of people who willingly do what they for a long time thought was wrong because the circumstances were such that they were forced to pick a lesser evil. And it's not like they feel good about it, but they are willing to actually to take on moral injury for the sake of something that they believe is the only choice they had, that was the word in terrible circumstances. So, and I'm going to go through this fast because I think probably a lot of you have been exposed to these definitions. In fact, I see colleagues and friends on the list who've I've worked with on this. So basically, there are sort of two prevailing definitions that are not quite identical, but relate to each other. The first is Jonathan Shea's sense that moral injury is being the betrayal of what's right by someone who holds legitimate authority in a high stakes situation. So all three elements have to be there. I think the betrayal by a legitimate authority can also be systems where there's no single decision maker, but it's a system that locks in immorality or things that aren't right, and the system is hard to change. So that and things like patriarchy and like that. So the second definition is a little later. Shea worked with Vietnam era veterans, a lot of whom were conscripted into a war they thought was immoral. In the case of Litz, they're working with post-conscription, after the draft was eliminated, people was all volunteer military. And they focused on the lasting psychological, biological, spiritual, behavioral, and social impact of perpetrating, failing to prevent, or bearing witness to acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. So Larry Graham, a pastoral theologian, referred to the Shea definition as the receiving the harm, a receptive moral injury, and to the Litz definition, a gential moral injury. In fact, I think the two overlap considerably, especially as related to climate change. So I'm going to say a little bit about the distinguishing PTSD from moral injury, because they get confused a lot, partly because they have overlapping symptoms sometimes, but the cause of those symptoms is a little bit different. With PTSD, the problem is an overactive fear center because you were terrorized, and that fear system stores memory in a different way than our normal memory processing system. So we can have flashbacks, or what's called dissociative episodes and nightmares. But the symptoms of PTSD relate to the re-experiencing of the terrorizing stuff that happened. So it's the fear-related feelings during the experiences that are symptomatic of PTSD. It's just your fear system won't let go of it. With moral injury, it's not fear-based. You can have a terrorizing experience as the reason for your moral injury, but moral injury is a response of conscience, which is really engaging your, not just your fear center, but your thinking brain that evaluates moral violations. And you can have moral injury without PTSD. You can be a decision maker who wasn't involved in the terrorizing incident, but made the decision, and then have moral injury because you made that decision. So it doesn't necessarily involve PTSD, but it often does. So moral injury is actually related to the moral emotions, the painful moral emotions like guilt and shame and remorse and sorrow that come after what happened. And so it's not on a clock. You can get moral injury and it's decades later. So moral injury is different from PTSD in that way, but they share responses of anger. And moral injury, it's outrage at what happened. In PTSD, fear can produce aggression and anger. So anger can look the same, but they really have a different origin. And I want to spend the last little few minutes of my talk on why I think chaplaincy work is so important in moral injury work, because it's different from therapy. And that's because moral injury is an ordinary human experience, not a disorder. So a psychological disorder requires fixing a distorted relationship to reality, and bless the therapists that know how to do that work, because a psychological disorder can be a devastating thing to be living with. So I'm not disparaging therapy. I just think there aren't enough therapists in the world, and there's a lot of work that chaplains can do around moral injury that doesn't require a therapist. The second thing is moral injury recovery is not about being fixed. It's about accepting what happened and acknowledging and letting yourself feel the feelings that are so painful, because they're true and valid. They're the response of someone who is moral. And so the struggle with moral injury is how to deal with the memory of the experience and the painful feelings in a process that enables the mitigation, the calming down of the worst feelings, so that the memories can be integrated into a life narrative without driving behavior. So that's the main task, I think, of support for moral injury. And this is a slightly different comparison about the two approaches. The therapeutic approach has a lot of neuroscience behind it. It's biomedicalized. It's deeply researched. So that's really important. But the treatment process is what I would call transactional. It's unidirectional. When you seek a therapist help, their job is to really figure out and help you figure out what's going on and suggest things that you could do, and basically help you recover through prescribed protocols for a diagnosis. With chaplaincy, it's more of a support model. It can even bring in community people. It's that kind of support for someone who's suffering in a way that it can help them recover. but it doesn't have a formal diagnosis and protocol because it's not therapy. And the therapeutic model evaluation, diagnosis, and treatment is how it works. With chaplaincy, it's a lot listening and accompaniment. You can also make suggestions to help people in their recovery process, but it really begins with being where the person is and accompanying them through a process of change. And a major difference is in the therapeutic model, as the medicalized model, there's hourly billing, and with chaplaincy, you can do it, you can work as long as you need to with someone without worrying about, am I going to be paid for this time? And so there, unless you're not salaried and working for free, it's also therapeutic work is sincerity based. The person themselves has to look at their feelings and change themselves through the therapeutic process. With chaplaincy, I think you have the power of ritual as part of your toolkit for helping people change. And rituals actually ask people to step out of their personal sincerity and engage with a sort of creative and maybe even playful process. And at the end, they're changed and they don't know why, because they didn't have to do it themselves. And with therapy, you never see the therapist again after you're okay. With chaplaincy, you can continue to maintain connections with people. And that's important for moral injury, I think. So Rabbi Blumenthal says moral injury is a sign of health. The kinds of things that indicate moral injury is acute and not addressed is that list: fury, frustration, humiliation, guilt, shame, despair, cynicism, and suicidality. And this is my last point. Signs of recovery include a willingness to accept suffering as a sign of moral character. In other words, it's really the goodness in you really seeking resolution. It's return to relationships. There's often broken trust and self-isolation. So people are able to return to their relationships and community fully as a integrated self, because they have to integrate what happened. That's part of recovery. With that increasing integration of moral injury experiences, they become a source of information and wisdom in a life. They actually can become, in the terms like a wounded healer, a way where your own experience is useful to others in their recovery process. And another sign of recovery is the ability to look forward, to connect to others, and to be able to experience positive emotions like joy, wonder, and curiosity. So that's the work of, I would say the work of chaplains is that process. And I just want to let you know that if you're working with people you think are morally distressed, we have a free online hour processing program. I know at least one of our facilitators is here today. It's called REST, and it's free and open to the public, and anyone can use it. We have one for veterans or at the regular REST, we call it. Then we have a special URL for first responders who are struggling with moral distress. And we also have chaplains that can visit also. Plenty of chaplains are carrying moral distress or moral injury. And then Susan Diamond and I did this podcast, and you'll get a PDF of this. So all of this information will be in the PDF. I'm going to stop my share now. So thank you all for listening. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Rita, for, wow, laying the amazing foundation here of all of the research and concepts that you've packed into a very short amount of time. So appreciate it. Our second presenter today is Liz Farmer, who's an ordained chaplain and lay leader of Zen Buddhism under the guidance of Roshi Joan Halifax. Liz has served as a chaplain and meditation teacher in healthcare, education, and carceral settings as well. She currently works for Spiritual Care Services of Maine, where she provides telehealth chaplaincy, as well as mobile outreach to people experiencing homelessness in Portland, Maine. Liz additionally co-leads a spiritual community in Southern Maine dedicated to the intersection of social justice and Buddhist teachings, and she serves as a mentor for students in the Opaya Zen Center's chaplaincy training program. And during her own chaplaincy training, Liz wrote a master's level thesis on spiritual care for veterans experiencing moral injury, and has since taught on moral suffering and moral resilience in a variety of settings. And I'll just add that We first came to know Liz at the BTS Center when she came and gave the staff a presentation on moral injury and moral resilience around climate. So Liz, welcome. We're so glad you're with us today.
Thank you so much, Allison. I'm really happy to be here. And thank you also, Rita, for that beautiful framing. It just resonates so much with what's already been shared. And I think Nicole is going to be sharing a few slides for me. Thank you, Nicole. So yeah, I'd actually like to start with an example of how I have experienced moral distress in my work as a chaplain. Because I think in addition to what Rita shared about how chaplains can support others in working with moral distress and moral injury, it's really important to reflect on how to work with our own moral suffering as chaplains, and also how to resource ourselves so that we can serve others in a more skillful way. So that's the focus of my comments, and then I'm excited to get to our questions and discussion as well. So as Allison mentioned, my most recent chaplaincy work has been serving unhoused people in Portland, Maine. And this photo that you're seeing shows part of an encampment where about 100 people were living last fall, and that was forcibly cleared by police in January. And I want to say I didn't go into this work thinking of myself as a climate chaplain, but my view has actually shifted. And if we can go to the next slide, I think um, many of us are aware that the people who are most impacted by climate change tend to already be vulnerable or on the margins in some way. And so, for the unhoused population in Maine, if you're living and sleeping outside right now, extreme weather has really added to the challenges of this experience. And just thinking about this winter, we've had multiple very heavy rainstorms followed by extremely cold temperatures. We've seen flooding completely ruin people's belongings, as you can see in this photo on the right. And the huge weather fluctuations we're seeing with climate change, at least in New England, can also be very hard on people's physical health when you're living outside in those big fluctuations, as well as, of course, mental health, anxiety, stress. So, while climate change, of course, affects all of us, it's a whole other layer of disruption for people living outside. And as a chaplain, part of my role is bearing witness to people's experience, hearing their stories, and trying to discern a skillful response in the midst of what really often feel like dysfunctional or broken systems. And as Rita was sharing, moral distress or injury can arise when we witness moral harm, including the harm caused by systems of power. So in my own work, I would describe almost like a double moral distress. First, in witnessing the failure of city and state leaders to provide affordable housing, not to mention the choice to destroy the makeshift housing folks had built, as you can see in this other photo of the encampment being torn down in January. And then secondly, there's the broader failure to address climate change. So, understanding, of course, that the causes and accountability here are very complex, but the outcomes that I'm seeing are that those failures are causing a tremendous amount of suffering and really disproportionately harming those with fewer resources and less power. So I think I just want to make that point first, that as chaplains, we may not be engaging in climate work explicitly, but many of us are bearing witness to the impacts of climate change in our work. And so we may also be experiencing moral distress or even moral injury as a result of that. So how might we work with this? Rita shared the impacts of unaddressed moral injury and also how we can respond to that and what are the signs of recovery. And I just want to build on that a little by speaking about cultivating moral resilience, which is a way to resource ourselves so that we can meet moral adversity in a healthy way. And yes, thank you. Perfect timing, Nicole. And because our time is really brief, so I'm going to focus mainly on chaplains and how we can support this in ourselves. But some of what I'll share can be applied in other settings too, that we might be serving in. And I want to note too that I'm drawing here mainly from literature in healthcare. The application of these concepts to climate change is fairly new, but I think we can certainly make some inferences. So there are a number of definitions of moral resilience. I'm using Cinda Rushton's, which is the capacity of an individual to sustain or restore their integrity in response to moral complexity, confusion, distress, or setbacks. And I really appreciate this emphasis on resilience being about how we respond to moral adversity, because it highlights that we do have agency, we do have choices, and we can respond to moral suffering in healthy ways. So what does that look like, that healthy response? I want to share a little bit more on this next slide, a quick sketch of the attributes of a morally resilient person, and then I'll get to how chaplains can actually cultivate this within ourselves. So this is drawing from a content analysis in the healthcare literature, which suggests that the hallmark trait of morally resilient people, which is very connected to the definition I just shared, is integrity. And more specifically, the capacity to sustain integrity in response to moral adversity. So as chaplains, this is in part the capacity to notice, first of all, when moral conflict or distress is present. And then with that noticing, to make a choice, however small, to come back toward alignment with our own integrity. So that could manifest as taking some kind of action, for example, perhaps working toward systems level changes in some way, or maybe building solidarity with people who are most impacted by immoral policies. So just as an example, here in Portland, clergy and chaplains came together several times in protest of the encampment sweeps, just wanting to voice our disagreement in a public way with what many of us considered to be an immoral policy, because we've seen over the course of the last year how these sweeps can be not just traumatizing for unhoused people, but they can actually put people's lives at risk. So that's just a brief example from my own work, but the point here is finding ways to stay in integrity in the midst of morally challenging situations. Buoyancy is, I love this word. It's the ability to adapt to changing circumstances, to sort of stay afloat rather than be dragged down by despair. And so a morally resilient person has a certain capacity to be with uncertainty and change, and asking, what is a skillful response in this moment? And then tomorrow as conditions evolve. So this kind of flexibility of thinking. Moral efficacy is the belief that we can do something about the moral dilemmas we face. So just, remembering that we always have agency, even when things might feel quite dire, knowing that our actions still matter. Self-regulation, very important. This is the ability to influence our emotions and our thoughts. And by influence, I do not mean repressing or bypassing. Rita spoke so beautifully to how important it is to really feel our feelings about this, but also becoming aware enough that we're not just reacting out of an emotional place, but finding space so that we can respond skillfully. It's of course important to have the feelings we're having and process them around climate change, but just again, recognizing that if we get stuck there, they can sometimes drive us to unintentionally cause more harm to ourselves or others. And then lastly, self-stewardship. This is referring to the attitudes and behaviors we take to maintain our health and well-being. So people who are morally resilient tend to have a range of strategies here, and I'll say more about that on this next slide, which is almost the last one. This is just a starting place, definitely not an exhaustive list of how to cultivate moral resilience. And these are practices I've learned mainly through ongoing training at Upaya Zen Center that I have personally found very helpful. And there's much more for sure, but these are just at least a few concrete practices to take with you. This first one is reflecting on our values. Rita noted on that first slide, I believe, she talked about our moral orienting system that we all have and how that operates generally without our thinking about it. It's below the level of thought. And so intentionally actually calling to mind, reflecting on our values can help bring that moral orienting system into our conscious awareness. And we also then become more attuned to when it begins to be compromised, which, as we've both been saying, can be a kind of mindfulness bell so that we can come back in alignment and integrate what has happened. I do this sometimes as part of my morning meditation practice. It could also be as simple as just pausing for a few minutes in your day, remembering the values that root you in your work. Why are we serving as chaplains? You know, how do we embody our values in whatever context we're serving in? So the second thing here is seeking out peer support. Rita talked about how often moral injury can be associated with shame and grief, guilt, these really difficult feelings. And I know for myself, sometimes those feelings can be compounded when I feel like I'm holding them alone. So having spaces to collectively name the moral suffering we're feeling and processing that together can be really helpful. And we have, so sorry. We have two great examples right here in the room. One that Rita already shared about the peer support groups with Volunteers of America, and also what the BTS Center does in so many of its offerings for clergy around climate change. So those are just two examples of peer support right here. And peer support could also be really informal, you know, talking with a colleague and sharing how moral distress is coming up and how you're working with it. So these last two, cultivating an open mindset. When we experience distress or anxiety, we tend to get very narrow in our thinking and our scope of awareness, kind of what we're able to pay attention to. And the challenge is that when we're in that narrow place, it's really difficult to engage qualities like, you know, curiosity or imagination or our capacity to be with complexity, to be with not knowing. And we need those qualities because the nature of grappling with climate change is there is so much complexity and uncertainty there. So in order to meet that in a resourced way, we can practice noticing our own mental state. And when we're in that narrow place, to engage in practices that help create a little more space around strong emotions and thoughts. So many forms of meditation and contemplative practice can serve in this way. Cinda Rushton also sometimes suggests asking questions like, what else is true right now? Or what else is possible, just to begin opening the scope of awareness a little more. And lastly, I just want to mention self-stewardship again as so important to developing moral resilience and just serving as a chaplain so that we can take care of our own well-being and show up more skillfully without burning out. This could take many forms. I suspect everyone here has some go-to practices, but just to name three very briefly, really relevant in the context of climate change is grief work. We all need to process the grief we hold around climate change. The Good Grief Network is a really wonderful resource here. The BTS Center has the Lament with Earth offering. So taking care of our grief is essential. Meditation, really supportive of self-regulation, which I spoke to in the previous slide, and just being with suffering in a more regulated way. And then lastly, being in nature and remembering ourselves as nature, remembering that we're not separate from nature and allowing for awe and joy to arise. Being able to connect with gratitude for what we still have, even in the midst of all of the impermanence and change that our planet is experiencing. So I'll end there. The last slide that's here is just a couple of photos from one of the actions I mentioned that clergy took here in Portland, in addition to, of course, providing material and spiritual support to the unhoused people who were impacted. So love to hear questions and what else is here?
Liz, let me add my thanks to you. Just wonderful grounding this information, these concepts in on the ground work, and beautiful descriptions of resilience as well, and cultivating that both for ourselves and for those who we tend to in chaplaincy. Michael and I are going to kick off a couple of questions to both Rita and Liz, and while we collect your questions from the chat, so please feel free to add those there. The question that I have for both of you, I was really struck, Rita, when you were talking about the fact that moral injury is experienced harm, particularly from systems, and we all are living in systems that are creating conditions for harm, and also by transgressing when you know what is right. And I'm thinking about climate and how, in some ways, we are in a pinball machine back and forth between those two things as individuals in that system. So I wonder, Rita, if you might want to talk a little bit more about the distress and the despair and really almost the paralysis that comes from that. And maybe Liz, you could address it from a resilience place, just talking about how we can't change some of what it is that is baked in around climate.
Yeah, there's a lot we can't change. That's part of the struggle, I think. There's the magnitude of a global economic system that is completely constructed on growth. So the US is now way down the list in social inequality economically. We're last time I looked at a UN study, we sat just above Uganda in social inequality. So we have fallen off much of the industrialized world's lists as a leader in equality. And the only solution people have for fixing that kind of social inequality is economic growth, growing unions and jobs, and raising salaries, and that. And I also know that my own capacity to retire hinges on a climbing stock market. So those are just facts. There isn't a whole lot I feel I can do about that. I don't want us to be home, unhoused and starving when I'm 80. And yet but I'm sort of locked into that system. And I think anybody who's employed is locked into that system. So partly I try to look at, there are economists who talk about steady state economics and maybe non-growth economies, but we're actually going to need to shrink, and that will devastate the people least able to handle it. So there's that paradox and that problem, and I have to say, I don't feel those problems in the same deep way I feel distress at the local level when I see flooding and I see people losing their homes and I see people dying because of the disasters of climate change. And I just think that's kind of a human tendency at the local level, where you actually care about individuals and things you feel more deeply, those threats and losses. And I'm very aware that we have had an incredibly oddly mild winter in Minnesota. And so we've had some beautiful 50 to 60 degree days that are, they're wonderful to go out and walk in. It's warm, it feels really good. And yet there's always this little sense of, I shouldn't really be enjoying this. This is not a sign of a good thing that we're having a day in February that's 60 degrees. So those are, I think those are just some of the, I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, there's the lithium in our phones. We're embedded in a fossil fuel and connected system globally that exploits human beings and the environment. So I also work in a job where I have to travel a lot. I'm grateful that Zoom has enabled this, so I didn't have to go somewhere to give this talk. And for that, I'm grateful actually, but you know, Zoom is run by electricity. Anyway, I don't have any solutions beyond long-term things we have to keep trying to do. It helps me to have friends that we remind each other of things, like we stay connected around doing better at being more responsible. That's helpful to me, is to be part of groups that hold me accountable.
Thanks so much. Liz, want to jump in here?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just add that I think often we can have a tendency to overemphasize individual responsibility for climate change over the systems. And not to say, you know, for some of us, it may still be the right choice to be in integrity with ourselves, not to fly, not to use certain products, not to eat meat, you know, and you know, by all means, I think it's great to embrace those choices. And at the same time, in terms of um, having a clear seeing of impact, recognizing that we don't need to hold piles of guilt for our individual actions, that really what's going to change things is a much broader systemic kind of transition and transformation. And so, and then as chaplains, back to your question about resilience, within all of that, asking ourselves, what can I do in the sphere of influence that I have, in the life that I have right now, to show up and be in integrity and make a difference in the ways that I can, and understand that this isn't about controlling outcomes. It's very likely that many things will happen that we don't want. And yet, what we can do is show up in alignment with ourselves and doing what we feel like is in integrity for us. So I'll just offer that.
Beautiful. I think Michael's got a couple of.
Yeah, so there are a lot of great questions that folks have put in the chat. So thank you for these, and please do continue to do that. We'll answer as many as we have time for. Carrie asks how, and I suspect this has to do with the type of work that folks are doing on a day-to-day basis. Do you have any thoughts on how to address moral injury and echo lament in spiritual directions? So maybe if there is an ongoing relationship with someone, how these things can be addressed in that setting.
I'm not a spiritual director, so I can just offer a thought based on my work as a chaplain, that certainly just being in conversation, being able to hold space for processing these feelings and these questions as part of someone's spiritual journey is itself, as Rita was painting that picture of kind of what chaplains can do that is different from therapists. All of those things have the capacity to really support healing and a shift in how someone is holding their moral distress or moral injury so that they can integrate it. And as she pointed out, not getting rid of anything or denying the reality of those experiences, but learning how to integrate them. Cinder Rushton often uses this beautiful metaphor of kintsugi, which is, the Japanese pottery that after it's broken, we glue it back together with gold. And so it's like, how do you remake something out of the broken pieces that is actually more resilient, not by hiding or denying what was harmed, but by actually working to integrate and heal.
I'm not a spiritual director either. I've been a chaplain in the past, mostly with young adults, but I think it's what we've found in our moral injury programs with veterans and then in our online rest program is giving people a chance to just pause and be with the negative feelings rather than running from them or trying to push them down with overwork, drugs, alcohol, whatever. Just giving people a chance in a small group that's safe, that's just peer. There isn't anybody in there trying to fix anybody. That capacity to connect with empathy across those lines of suffering has a sort of quality of magic, I think, to help people feel like what they're feeling is real, it's validated, and that somebody else in a room cares that they feel that way. That actually is freeing from the toxic nature of those feelings. It's like, oh, other people feel ashamed. Other people, oh, they understand how I'm feeling. Just sort of lifts the cloud of toxicity that comes with those feelings. It's not that the problem is fixed. It's not even that the feelings disappear. It's that they stop being so burdensome and give space for creativity and other things that those feelings can sit on top of and crush. And so that's not a one-on-one spiritual direction thing, but it's also something I think a spiritual director provides, is that person who validates and helps release some of the burden of those feelings.
I really appreciate both responses, particularly since, as you say, you're not spiritual directors, but that really seemed to hit right in the place. I think we have time for maybe one more question, and I really appreciated the question here. How can we integrate climate awareness, grief, moral injury into our work when it's not explicitly about climate work? And then she writes, personally, I'm a healthcare chaplain and I love my work, but it's hard to not be explicitly working in climate change. And my response to that is, no matter what sector, no matter what setting, you're doing your work in a climate change world. But I'm wondering if either of you have some more specific ways that you'd like to respond to that really good question.
I think it's a great question. I have a real simple answer to it. I think it is true that even things like healthcare and corrections and things that don't appear to be about the climate, I think are seriously impacted by climate change. And I think even the permafrost releasing new viruses and new threats of pandemics are also part of the struggle with climate change that we're in. And it's also a society that I think overinvests in chemical and scientific and drug-oriented solutions to some things that could be alleviated in different ways that are more holistic, nutritional, those kinds of things. So I don't have a solution to those sorts of, but I do appreciate the turn in even in healthcare, because there aren't enough doctors to do all of these procedures and whatever, the turn toward looking at other factors like nutrition and social context and more of an epidemiological approach to certain things that have usually been individualized. And I think that's helpful also because it helps us think about the human condition in more connected systemic terms rather than as individual failures or just individual body problems.
I'll just say super briefly, I know we need to close, but and maybe this is a very Buddhist thing to say, but in my opinion, it really is all connected. And as I think is coming up in the chat, all of these systems are interrelated, and whether we're conscious of it or not, yeah, they're all impacted by climate change and the mindset underneath that.
Thank you. And if you folks haven't already saved the chat, please do. There's so much in the chat in terms of resources and exchange that I think is so helpful in this conversation. I'll just add my enormous gratitude to both you, Liz and Rita, for being with us today in such a generous and thoughtful and deeply, deeply committed way. Thank you. And I want to pass it over to Michael.
Thank you all so much, both to Rita and to Liz, for your expertise, your generosity, your sharing with us. Rarely do we ever come away from these events thinking, okay, I know exactly what to do now, but you have, of course, given us an enormous amount to think about. So thank you for sort of feeding that constructive conversation moving forward. And one thing I noted, a lot of folks saying, or either saying, or I know that this is the case of where you are, this is not something that I'm working on in my daily life. How can I incorporate that into the work that I am doing? And of course, that's the right response. And I just want to encourage everyone, when you see new resources from the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab, when you see events that we're having or whatever, even if it only seems tangential to the work that you're doing, please do come, because we try to make sure that everybody leaves with something that they can use, and we try to stimulate conversation that's useful no matter where you are. So we have some events coming up. One's going to be on residential chaplaincy on college campuses. So what happens if you put a chaplain in a dorm? That's going to be really interesting. We're going to have one on chaplaincy for folks working in memory care units. And so how to cross those communication barriers. So all of these things on the surface, they seem fairly specific, but I think that there is a lot for everyone to take away from. So please do come join us for that. And again, Rita, Liz, Allison, Nicole, thank you so much for having the lab here today.
Thank you all for this conversation. Let me just chime in with a couple things from the BTS Center that we invite you to continue the journey with us. Referencing the piece that Liz shared about the BTS Center offering peer support, we are offering ongoing spiritual direction to spiritual seekers and spiritual leaders where the context of our climate changed world is present as a partner in the conversation. These are small groups that meet monthly for 8 months, and we've heard from participants how important these spaces have been for discernment, companionship, rest, grief, and joy, which has come up a few times today. We have a diversity of facilitators offering a range of dates and times, and new groups are starting March this month and April. Oh, it's not quite March yet, tomorrow and April. Please see our website and consider whether one of these groups might be right for you. Also referenced during our gathering today, the BTS Center has partnered with The Many on Lament with Earth. The Many is an incredible group of liturgists and musicians, and they have created this series of seasonal worship-filled online opportunities for engaging with grief in community. Our next Lament with Earth gathering will be May 8th, and we'll be focusing on the element of water with co-host Water Spirit, an amazing Catholic-rooted organization in New Jersey. And finally, I share with you the Climate Changed podcast, which is available anywhere you listen to podcasts and on the BTS Center's website. The final episode in season 2 was just released on Tuesday, and episodes in this season have explored questions like, how can I keep going? And how do you love the world as it is? I serve as one of the co-hosts for climate change, so I hope maybe I will find my way into your earbuds or car radio sometime soon. Thanks so much. Back to you, Allison.
Thanks, Nicole, Michael, Rita, and Liz, and the behind the scenes folks like Ash and Alan and Ben who have been helping us out. I invite all of you to unmute and let's have a cacophony of goodbyes and gratitude to our speakers and to this time that we've shared together.
Lim Lim.
Thank you,
so
Rita,
much.
so
you.
much.
Everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Ever
Thank you.
grateful.
Bye.
Thank you, Liz.
Thanks, everyone.
Beautiful.